You would be shocked at the number of people that they get and the random people that they get to vote on some of these awards.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes to fruition when you see some of these lists. I get so upset even when I see the ballot of like Heisman voters, and you're just like, how? There's like 900 people. Half of them I feel like don't even cover college football. But to your point, probably Ohio State receivers stole a little production from each other, but it's absolutely crazy that a guy like Chris Olave is not on that list for his production, for his career, for his touchdowns, so on and so forth. Yeah, it's wild.
I know, and Garrett Wilson, though, he might even be drafted higher when we're in Vegas next year. Joel,
and neither of those guys are even the leading receiver on the team as far as yardage goes. That's Jackson Smith-Njigba. I mean, I'm telling you, all three of these guys are likely going to be first-round players. Jackson Smith-Njigba just still has to be there for another year. And here's the crazy part. Do you want to know the crazy part?
Sure.
They've got a number one wide receiver out of class, Julian Fleming, not a starter. Marvin Harrison Jr., who's an absolute freak, not a starter. And Emeka Egbuka, a number one wide receiver in a class, not a starter. They've got three guys that would start anywhere else in the country that don't play.
It's kind of crazy, and I think we're kind of touching on one of the challenges for Michigan on Saturday is covering these guys, and maybe the way to cover them is to make sure that C.J. Stroud isn't upright to throw to them. Is that a fair assessment of what Saturday is going to be about? Joel Klatt.
That's 100% accurate. And in the games in which Ohio State has struggled a little bit, that's been the only constant, is the fact that Stroud has not been comfortable in the pocket. Make no mistake about it. I know they've got a good back in Travion Henderson and a pretty good offensive line in terms of run blocking, but they're not a running team. This is not a J.K. Dobbins Ohio State or a J.T. Barrett, certainly Ohio State, or even a Justin Fields Ohio State. This is a team that resembles much more the Dwayne Haskins version of Ohio State on base downs, so 1st and 10, 2nd and 6 or shorter, base downs, base offense. They're throwing the football about 64, 65% of the time. That's a ton. That's as much as anybody in the country. And the way to get after a team like that, as we see throughout levels of football, when you see Brady in those pass-heavy offenses or Manning back in the day, is to get to them and to get to the quarterback and make him uncomfortable in the pocket. It just so happens that there's three defenses in the country, maybe four, that are uniquely suited to do just that. I would say Georgia and Bama, particularly with Bama with Will Anderson, and then Michigan and Wisconsin, which may be the next two opponents for Ohio State if they're able to beat Michigan. Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo are two of the best edge rushers in the country, and as a tandem for Michigan, they're presenting a ton of pressure, as much pressure as anybody in college football. Each of them have double-digit sacks, and the game rests completely on their shoulders. I know that's incredibly reductionist, if you will, in terms of philosophy, but that's really where it's at, because if Stroud is clean, you cannot stop Ohio State. And that was proven out last week and even the week before against Purdue.
What about the defensive scheme? Mike McDonald is the new defensive coordinator for Michigan. We all know that Don Brown, his defense was picked apart by Ryan Day, maybe even during the week, like the game plan picked it apart, and then the execution was just the easy part, What do you think about that with the crossing routes and the wide open receivers that Michigan has seen for years, too many years in this series?
One of the things that I remember meeting with Coach Day, even back when he was a coordinator in the Haskins year, and he just had this wry smile because Michigan was favored. They were coming into the horseshoe. They had a very good defense, if you remember. That was the Rashawn Gary defense and those players. And Ryan Day was just like, yeah, I've got a plan. And you have to remember that he coached with Don Brown back when they were both up in the New England area. I think I want to say New Hampshire, something along those lines. But anyways, they had coached together. And Ryan used to pick them apart in practice. And basically he used that game plan in front of, 12 million in the Michigan-Ohio State game. So enters Mike McDonald. And here's this young guy who's the linebacker coach for John Harbaugh at Baltimore. And he's a very NFL style of guy, and that's why they stood those two edge rushers up, and they want to run more of the Baltimore style of defense. But what they have more so now than they ever did before is answers. So they don't just have one pitch. Don Brown was like a really effective middle reliever who had one really good pitch. And when he was dominant, it was very good. And in particular, when they had the players that were better than the opposition. The problem is that you got somebody in Ohio State that was faster than them, that could block them, and they had no other pitch to get to. There was no secondary pitch. There was no adjustment from Don Brown's defense. So Ohio State just ravaged them. And to be fair, anybody with like talent or better talent would beat Michigan. And that was the knock on Jim Harbaugh. And it was really more about Don Brown and his defense and his lack of a secondary pitch. Now Mike McDonald comes in, and the defense maybe not as dominant at times over teams that they're better than, but they've got a secondary pitch, so they can adjust much better than they used to. So I've said this all year long. This does not mean I'm picking Michigan or that they're going to win. I just think that they're more suited for this game than they have been in previous years. They are built better because of those answers that they have on the defensive side for what Ohio State will bring, namely the fact that they can present pressure whether they're blitzing or not. They don't have to steal resources from the back end to present pressure on C.J. Stroud in the pocket because of those two edge rushers that I was talking about.
Joe Klatt here on the Rich Eisen Show. He and Gus Johnson getting set with the rest of the Fox crew to cover Michigan, Ohio State on Saturday right here on the Rich Eisen Show. So you've established that Michigan defensively is better suited for this game than in recent years. Offensively, they've been running the heck out of the football all year long, and that's another way that you could keep Ohio State's high-octane offense off the field. What about the Buckeyes' defense? How are they suited to take Michigan's run game out this weekend?
Ohio State has had, how do you put this? They've had to in-season adjust more than anybody in college football because of their absolute failure against Oregon. If you go all the way back, a game that Gus and I called, in the shoe, second week of the season, couldn't stop the run game, couldn't adjust on defense. They had a lot of young players out there that were overwhelmed, to be quite honest with you. And Ryan made a big decision, and he took the play calling duties from Kerry Combs, and they kind of spread it out throughout the defensive staff. And now here we are, and they're playing much better defense. From that point, they have been a much more sound defense. I wouldn't call them a great defense, but they're certainly more suited to stop people than what they had been previous in those first couple of weeks. They're starting to run a little bit more zone coverage instead of man coverage. That puts more eyes in the backfield and lets these athletes kind of run around. And then they've got young players that have developed during the course of this season, namely a defensive end named JT Tuimoloau. He was one of the top 5 recruits in college football entering the season, and he's been outstanding for them. Denzel Burke, a true freshman at corner, who we're going to call his name in a couple of years as a top 10 pick in the NFL draft, Rich. So these are young guys that are developing, and that defense is much better. Now, having said that, I thought that the biggest issue for Michigan was the fact that they were one-dimensional on offense for a lot of the season and only could run it. And now they've developed the passing game, and I think that their quarterback, Cade McNamara, has developed into a real threat in the passing game. And then what they've done is, after losing their number one wide receiver in the first week of the season, Ronnie Bell, they have now established a few guys that can go out there and catch the ball and be effective. Their tight end, Eric All. They've got a freshman wide receiver named Andrell Anthony, who is very good against Michigan State. And then they've got a freshman running back who actually, as a receiver, catching the ball out of the backfield, went for 170 yards last week. So they're starting to develop some of those threats, and that's where I think it's going to be a fascinating matchup, is that defense against the offense. Because on the other side, you've kind of got great against great pass rushing against great passing defense, and the unknown is what happens when Cade McNamara and the Wolverine offense is on the field against that Buckeye defense.
Yeah, you're referring to Donovan Edwards, who had a terrific game against Maryland. Joel, I looked it up, and I think the last time both teams entered this rivalry contest coming off of 50 burgers themselves was 1983. I mean, like,
isn't that crazy?
It's I don't know if that stat's accurate. I would have your research look it up. I'm just a man who's trying to pass the time because I'm so nervous-sided about this. But this. And I know that there's other games going on this weekend. I totally know,
none of them are like this.
No.
I know it's rivalry week, but this one is just sucking all the air out of college football, and rightly so. I mean, winner goes. You got the Harbaugh effect. You've got the Ohio State effect. I mean, this is as big of a game as I've ever called. I'm nervous-sided, to be honest with you, Rich. I mean, hopefully, I can do this thing justice and lay out and make sure that everyone's enjoying it.
Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.